Hi, today I'm going to talk to you about vermicomposting. Vermicomposting. So that's basically just worm composting, right? We're using worms to do the composting for us. And I'm going to tell you the basics of how to do it, why, and then last I'm going to wrap up with how you go about it. Like, what does the actual kind of setting it up look like? And I'm going to show you my actual vermicomposting setup so that you can know what it looks like, get some little tips and tricks. So stick around for that. First of all, I have to make a confession though. I failed at composting numerous times. I tried over and over, and I did it really badly. I grew mold, and I'm pretty sure I killed some worms because I thought worms would help if I threw it into my compost pile. And I got one of those bins that you just turn it, and I thought, well, that'll help. I'll just throw my stuff in there. I didn't fully understand what you have to put in to be able to help it actually work, and I didn't understand it at all. Let's just be honest. So with regular composting, you need greens and browns, and with vermicomposting, it's the same thing. You need greens and browns. They eat both. So greens being like plants. You chopped up your vegetables for dinner and you had the ends or the stems that you're not going to eat. Those are greens. Those will go in and they'll eat them. Apples, like I've had leftover apples and they just love those. They'll go to town on them. I wouldn't suggest sweet potatoes. I'll tell you about my story with sweet potatoes later, but the browns, the place where I actually got this last set of worms, all they grow them in is some like moistened, damp cardboard cut up into little squares. And that's actually where they breed them and feed them and do a lot of things so that they can keep their worm population going. But they do use them on a larger scale for composting, and that's where I get my compost and my mulch and now my worms. So the bottom line is worms like to eat that stuff. They don't eat everything, but there's other critters, bugs, insects, whatever you want to call them, bacteria also would play a part in this, that will help do their part to decompose the matter. And this is like the natural way, right? This is actually how it happens in nature. So even if you were to cut down parts of a tree or a plant and leave it on the ground, this is what would happen. You would have a mold or something, and then other little insects and tinier ones and then larger ones, or however it goes, would all come and they would eat off of it, and they would poop and they digest it and poop out. And what they poop out is more smaller molecules that provide nutrients to the soil. So what's actually helping your plants is worm poop. That's essentially it. It's worm poop. But what that worm poop carries with it is all the good stuff, right? Because the nutrients are now in a more absorbable form, and you have all the bacteria, the good bacteria that came from the worm gut. And so you put that stuff into your plant just like you would, like if you're planting something, you would put some compost and you put a handful of worm droppings, and then that actually helps give it more nutrients. It helps it give it more vitamins, and plants really do well when you give this to them. And I think they even call it some kind of black gold or something like that, but it really does help. So I didn't get into composting just to help my plants. I actually didn't get into composting to help plants at all. I got into composting because I realized, and my sons helped me realize, that we had all of this waste. And we didn't really have an ability to recycle everything. Like, not everything that you send to recycling is recyclable. The facility has to be able to have that capability to recycle it, or to have somewhere to send it to be recycled. So that's why you get a list and it tells you like what can actually go, is because that's what they're actually capable of recycling. But from what I understand, there's a significant amount of waste of recycling that that industry calls wish cycling, but really it just ends up in the garbage. There's a significant amount, and it was something ridiculously small, like 10 or 15% of what we recycle that actually gets recycled. So I was really frustrated. And of course, we're all frustrated with plastics, right? Nobody wants to be having more plastics. And so I thought, okay, first of all, we have to figure out how to buy less so that, or buy stuff that's glass or things that we're not generating more plastics. And some of it you just can't help because you buy one thing and it's got 3 layers of plastic on it and you're like, well, great. So that aside, I decided composting would be the way. And then I failed, and then I failed again. And we really didn't know what to do at that point. And I saw an ad online for the mill, and it's this basically like a dehydrator, and it dries out your food waste so that it's just like, it looks like these coffee grounds. I don't know. That's what it shows on the commercial. I don't actually have one. Here in Phoenix, there's another company that they partner up with that will come and pick those up, take it to farms that will then compost it there, and then somehow it's supposed to circle back around so that I can buy the food that helped grow. But by the time I ran across that, I was like, I don't want to give them my compost. I want my compost. So I'm happy for them and I want them to have that, but that's not me. So how do I do this? So I was searching more and I came across vermicomposting. The other things that we did to deal with waste, while I'm on that before I move on with vermicomposting, was to try to buy compostable garbage bags. Now, I'm not supporting any particular brand. This brand in particular, let me find what happened to them as I tried to just tear them off the roll. Yeah, it just kind of tore. And then, like I said, I'm not endorsing this brand because this brand, if you get it damp at all, it just like melts a hole in it. It's really super compostable is what it is. So these are really only made for trash, like dry trash, not anything like if you wipe down your counter or anything, like, and I'm not talking like using a non-reusable sponge or something. I'm talking like we have a spill and then you wipe it up with a paper towel or something, and you can't put that in here until it's more dry, or you set it on something inside the garbage to dry, because otherwise it will just dissolve and then it's stuck inside your garbage can, and you might as well have not had a garbage bag anyways, because you're taking the whole garbage out. Now that's probably the best solution, but I think these were the ones we ended up really liking. I tried like 3 or 4 of them. I don't like just the ones that say, oh, it's got recycled plastic in them. I suppose that's better, but how do I know what kind of processing, what kind of distribution it took to get that recycled material into that new bag? I mean, sometimes it's worse. So I would rather have a bag that I know goes out and it's compostable. It does say compostable on there. And doesn't dissolve in my trash can. Now, like I said, we're pulling a lot of that food waste out now, and that goes to the worms. And so there isn't as much wet material there, and we have a garbage disposal that helps get rid of, some of that stuff. But there's some things that just can't go to the worms or to the garbage disposal. Like, I'm not going to put a bunch of grease or, like I said, just there's some things that get wet and you have to throw them in the garbage that you wouldn't feed to anybody. So you need something a little bit more sturdy. Now, I encourage everybody, please go try this stuff out on your own, including vermicomposting. So I'm going to show you the simple setup that I have that I learned online watching videos just like this one. So the first part of it is this, I believe it's a 12 or a 16 gallon Sorry, I didn't have my glasses on when I actually showed the label, but you're probably seeing the label right now. So I have this small tote. It's not crazy small, but it's small. And I got coconut coir, and it comes in bricks. And you essentially put that in there. You put quite a bit of water because it has to moisturize, and this coconut coir is very, very dry. So if you have your worms, I would have this ready ahead of time because it can take a minute to absorb enough moisture. You have to break up the clumps. Excuse me, I don't know if you saw me, I was still breaking up clumps. And it's been there like 2 or 3 months now. It's not new. So you put your cocoa coir in there. You put your worms in there with, I put like a little bit of food at first, and that kind of tells me whether or not they're eating and they're happy. And then I come back and I check on them in a few days when I first put them in. But you can order these worms online. There's like Bob's Red Worms or something like that you can get a bag of worms delivered to you. But I again encourage you to have everything set up. Your tote, your cocoa coir that's already moistened, and then something, whether it's a piece of lettuce or a chopped off end of a strawberry or whatever you want, something that you can put in there to help feed them. They need browns and greens, so you could also chop up some cardboard and put pieces of that in there that's moistened. Don't put it in dry. But that's how you're going to feed them. So in order for things, I know I was leery too about whether or not it was going to stink or be growing mold or be doing all sorts of weird things. So what I found out in all my learning and digging when watching videos was if you bury it in the cocoa coir and then you make sure it's covered up, whatever food you put in there, then that doesn't attract all the flies and all of that stuff. And then I put the lid on it, and I make sure at least once a week that I'm, spraying them down, making sure that I'm adding a little bit of water. You don't want it to be juicy wet. Like, you don't want to be able to squeeze a handful of the cocoa coir and have water just wringing out of it. But you want it to be moist. And then, what was the other thing I was going to tell you? So, you need to make sure that your population of worms is going to continue. Everybody wants to just throw them in, and we don't necessarily, I didn't anyways, think about how long do these worms live. But what I was doing was purely by accident, providing them an area for them to breed. Worms have to come into contact with each other and rub against each other in order to reproduce. So they have a male and a female end, but they cannot mate with themselves. So they need another worm. And the way that I saw this happening at Arizona Worm Farm, that's where I go get a lot of my stuff, was they were feeding them only enough what they could eat at one time, and they would just sprinkle this layer of their food on the top of these bins where they were breeding them. And then the worms would all come up, they'd all be out there at the same time, and that's how they were reproducing. But I'm not a breeder. I'm just trying to keep my own population of worms going. So what I found, and again, this was by accident, was I would always end up with like 1 banana left, or sometimes 2 bananas. So most of the time it would just be this lone banana that went brown before we could eat it. And so I would break it open and I would bury it in the, in their bedding. And then I would go to check on them, and I would find just this lump of worms just all piled in there. They love banana. So I was inadvertently helping them breed. I didn't know that until I went and I took a class from Arizona Worm Farm. And I was like, oh, look, that's why my population is doing so good. So feed them worms. Not feed them worms. Feed them bananas. Feed the worms bananas. But if that's too small for you, where I actually learned how to feed them, and so that I guess the next question is, how do you get the good stuff out of there, right? Where I actually learned this, it was on a bigger scale. It was a nice long, I want to say she had multiple drums that were cut and welded together to make this long, really long drum setup that she had. I wish I had the video bookmarked. I would share it with you. But what she did was she fed in wedges. So she would feed starting at one end, and then she would move them. She would start feeding at the next wedge, and then she would, and they're composting that food as they go along. And then by the time that you want to pull out this end, you're feeding over here at this end, so the worms are over here, and you can just scoop out this side and feed here. And then when you get to this end, you just start, you work your way back, right? So I do that same thing in my little bin here. Now, you might see that I have two areas where I'm feeding, and I don't know, I tried to show where you could see the little white. I think they're mites. I'm not really sure what they are, but somehow something got in. And they came, when I first found them, they were on carrots. So this is part of the reason why I wear a glove when I'm trying to dig around in there, is I don't want to inadvertently introduce anything in. So I try to wear a glove when I'm working with them, even though I've held them in my bare hands. I'm not squeamish about that, but it is kind of fun to mess with my boys when I go, oh, I got the worm hands. And they get grossed out by it, but that's my fun. So anyways, my wormies, I call them wormies, so I might as well just come out with that. I handle my wormies, but I try to handle them with a glove on or two gloves, especially if I'm trying to do some mass moving around and clearing out one section, so that, and then I backfill with new bedding. So, I still do this in wedges, right? I still work from one side to the other, but I noticed that I had this problem. So I've been trying to isolate that so that I can just pull it out and get the majority of them out. So that's why it's kind of separate right there. Now, I was going to show you something else. What I would love for you to check out, and if I can, I'll show some pictures right here, is the Arizona worm farm. They do this on a massive scale. Like, it is a worm farm. Zach actually, he's found landscapers that taking care of places where they're not using any pesticides or anything like that, or herbicides, and they bring him their yard waste, right? And so then he chops up the trees, or they do that, and then he turns that into mulch. And then he has the worms that are decomposing all of that stuff along with whatever else is in those piles. And I mean, like, rows and rows of large scale composting happening. And then the worms are also in these under shade. So he's got a kind of a mixed setup, but the worms are in the part that's under the shade, but he has all the temperature monitoring down, all of that stuff for his composting pile. So in a way, I guess you could say it's a combination of traditional and the worms. And he'll just reach into one of the piles and show you, like, there's just a ton of worms right there doing their job. So I highly encourage you to grab some worms, start some vermicomposting. You can even put baskets into your garden as long as they're buried, and you put a cover over it. You don't have to have the little setup that I have. You can there's these baskets that you can buy that are designed for this. And you put them buried into the ground where you put all of your food waste, and then the worms just come and eat there. And then, of course, now they have a place where they're mingling. But then you want to make sure that you cover it. Otherwise, you can have some birds that are getting a little bit of a feast, just picking them off. So that's another way that you can do vermicomposting, that you'll get the direct benefit right there you won't even have to worry about, how do I pull out this section or anything like that. It's going straight into your garden. And that will be my next phase. Like, I will not continue. I'm not going to continue doing this where I have like a little tote. It was a great experiment. I now know that I can do that. And it was great. It was a great win for me. Like, sometimes we just need to see that it's working and that we did it a good job, right? So that was that for me. Now, I did promise that I would talk to you about sweet potatoes, though. I was trying to sprout some sweet potatoes so I could get some more to plant. And I had a slice that was from the middle, and it was a big slice. And I thought, oh, the worms will love this. And so I threw it in. That thing sprouted like you wouldn't believe. And there was so much roots. It was just insane. It took over a good section of the tote to where the worms were trying to leave because they didn't have any space. They were losing space quickly. And I would come into the room where I have them, and I'd find dried out worms around the carpet, like in a sprayed out around my tote. And I was like, oh my God, my wormies, what is going on? So I ended up dumping that tote into my patio flower bed, grow bed, whatever. It's in my experimentation area, really. And I found that it was just this mass of roots. And there were some small sweet potatoes that had formed, and the worms were eating them. They just hadn't started eating fast enough to be able to take down that sweet potato before it just went crazy. So, lesson learned. And I hope this is encouraging to you. I hope it inspires you to do something similar, to grab a bag of worms and use this in your garden.